This video is supported in part by Retro Days, a place for nostalgia nerds to gather, share memories, chat, and engage. Go to retrodays.com or check their YouTube channel linked below.
Look, I played way more than my fair share of Donkey Kong Jr. in the arcades as a kid, but remember the days when the big deal was bringing that arcade experience home? What was the best version of Donkey Kong Jr. they had for home consoles, and more importantly, what was the worst? We're gonna run them all down right now.
Don't you know that you're a grown up? No games, no consoles. Not allowed if you're a grown up.
Hey there, welcome back to Gen X Grown Up. I'm John, I'm a Gen X Grown Up, and I want to thank you for checking out this video, and with any luck, the rest of the channel. You know, like most nerdy Generation Xers, I spent way more time than probably was healthy in hindsight in video game arcades. But if you couldn't get your parents or your older sibling to drive you to the mall, what you had to settle for was the home port version of your favorite arcade games brought to your console. Now, probably unsurprisingly, my daughter works at a vintage video game store. Yeah, the same daughter that found that Miss Pac-Man board game for me not too long ago. Yeah, what a great daughter. Well, anyway, they were cleaning out the back room at this vintage game store where she works, and she came across some great classic arcade games for old consoles and brought them home to me. Now, I'm more than happy to add these to my old video game collection, but it did get me thinking, how many versions of Donkey Kong Jr. were ported to home consoles? And how do they stack up to the original? So for this video, what I've done is go back and replay 9 versions of Donkey Kong Jr. The original arcade classic, of course, plus 8 home ports that were ported to popular home consoles at the time. And we're gonna find out, starting at the best, what did a great job of Donkey Kong Jr., all the way down to number 8, the worst. And, you know, suck it up, Buttercup, because I may be trashing one of your favorites, just be warned. Yeah, there's no mistaking the original Donkey Kong Jr. I mean, just look at it. Beautiful. This was a follow-up to the original Donkey Kong, obviously. Well, in the sequel, Mario has captured DK, and you play his son, Donkey Kong Jr., appropriately enough, who's making his way through 4 different screens in various sequences in an attempt to rescue your dad from the clutches of the villainous plumber. Now, these different versions we're going to play kind of go fast and loose with these 4 different screens, so I'm not going to ding these ports for not having all of the screens are in the right order, since that's just kind of a side effect. Instead, I'm going to go by the gaming experience and how close these ports get to replicating that OG Donkey Kong Jr. experience. Let's get going with the ports then, and we start with the number 1, the NES version of Donkey Kong Jr., released in 1983. I mean, just look at this. I never had an NES. I was a little too old for NES when it came out. The sounds are great, the screen layout is great. I have almost no complaints, even though they switched from the vertical 9x16 to the 4x3. I mean, it feels right, it looks good, it sounds good. It's hard to go wrong with this version of Donkey Kong Jr. If I had to pick one thing to ding this for, it's really just the order of the screens, but again, I promised I wasn't going to hold that against any of these ports, but they're all there, even in weird order, and the game itself just looks, feels, plays just like Donkey Kong Jr., so definitely earning that number 1 spot. Let's move on to the number 2 then, which is the Atari 7800 version of Donkey Kong Jr., released in 1988. Yeah, 1988. That's how tone-deaf Atari was in the late 80s. They still thought that they could drive an industry by just releasing ports of games that at that point were almost 7 or 8, 10 years old, pushing? Yeah. But look, it's a good version of Donkey Kong Jr. The graphics and audio are a little more, like, blippy sounding than I would like, but, I mean, the overall gameplay is great, it feels good. I mean, it's a solid version of Donkey Kong Jr. Yeah, the poor Atari 7800, it got such a bad rap. It was an orphaned box that came out years after the video game crash of '83. Like I mentioned, they were just pumping out ports, not giving it any real love, so what a missed opportunity. I mean, look how capable this box is to reproduce that original arcade game so well. But, you know, no crying over spilled milk. Let's move on to number 3, which is the Atari 8-bit version of Donkey Kong Jr., released in 1984. This version of DK Jr. is a little palette compromised, but the Atari 8-bit was my go-to version of home play for Donkey Kong Jr. Kind of in the mid to late 80s, I was using Atari computers, and I played the heck out of this version. It was perfectly serviceable. The sounds are better than the 7800, but what I found was the hit detection is garbage. I mean, it's hard to not fall off of stuff or not sure if you're going to grab a vine when you jump. So it ends up being not as much fun, sort of, I guess. And there's limited frames of animation. I mean, just look how choppy it is. It looks like only, 2 different cells for any kind of movement, and they're kind of jumping many pixels between movements. And all of that gives it less of a smooth feel, a little rougher around the edges, but still it's one close to my heart, and ranking it number 3, I think it's respectable. Let's move on to number 4, the ColecoVision version of Donkey Kong Jr. for 1983. Not too bad here, right? I mean, this rounds out the top half of my countdown, or count up, I guess, whatever it is. I was always jealous of ColecoVision owners because they shipped an awesome version of Donkey Kong that packed in with every single console, and it was way superior to what I had on my Atari. But Donkey Kong Jr., they play pretty fast and loose with the color palette, the sprites, the jumping physics are abysmal. I mean, it's just so rubber bandy here. It almost makes it feel like a different game. In fact, if you didn't know, look at this Mario. Is that supposed to be Mario? You might not know this was a DK Jr. port at all. I mean, the Mario looks more like the Captain Lou Albano version of Mario than the one we know from DK. So the ColecoVision rounds out the top half of our count up, if you will. It's all downhill from here. Let's move on to the number 5 version of Donkey Kong Jr. for the BBC Micro, released in 1984. Ooh, I bet you weren't braced for these pink gorillas. Man, the BBC Micro release of DK Jr. either had limited or no release, depending on who you ask, but man, somebody should either have given this some more love or shelved it entirely because it escaped into the wild, and it's widely played by people that had a BBC Micro. But, I mean, it looks terrible, it plays terrible, controls are so sloppy, and the hideous palette, I mean, it's hard to look at. But, at least, unlike ColecoVision, Mario looks like Mario here, so I guess you got that going for you, Micro. Okay, let's move on to the number 6 in our increasingly bad ports of Donkey Kong Jr., and that's going to be the Intellivision version, released in 1983. It's got to be pretty embarrassing in hindsight that this version of DK Jr. was released the same year as the NES version that ranked at the very top of our chart, being the best port, and this was for Mattel's flagship. And yeah, it was crushing the Atari 2600, but it just didn't hold a candle to what the NES could do, and this version of Donkey Kong Jr. shows it. Wow. I mean, look, I'll give the developers A for effort, but from everything from sounds to colors to bizarre sprites, this version's got it all, if by all you mean a collection of problems. So yeah, not the version you want to play for Donkey Kong Jr. Just 2 more. Let's move on to the number 7 in our increasingly bad ports of Donkey Kong Jr., and that is the ZX Spectrum port released in 1984. I never touched a ZX Spectrum, or Specky, as was lovingly nicknamed by mostly European owners, but it was the affordable go-to PC for many non-US Generation Xers. Yeah, however, no matter how cute its nickname is or how fondly it's remembered, it doesn't quite cut the mustard. And it's showing off its limitations here on Donkey Kong Jr. Somehow, Donkey Kong Jr. is bigger than his dad in the cage, and he moves like it too. He's sluggish, the controls are just atrocious, sound gives way to sloppy handling and bad collision detection. All that yields the specky version of Donkey Kong Jr. pretty much unplayable, but look, don't get too depressed, Spectrum fans, because you weren't the worst. Let's move on to the number 8 and worst port of Donkey Kong Jr., and that is the Atari 2600, released in 1983. Oh, I feel kind of bad for my beloved Atari 2600. Man, it was my first console, it was my first love with video games, but it just isn't right. What is this? Vertical stripes for vines? It was like a capital letter C. That's supposed to be the traps? Man, knowing what I know about the internal workings of the Atari 2600, I will say that this is probably a technical marvel. But even the Atari at its best just doesn't quite stack up, and it's not capable of running any version of Donkey Kong Jr. as a port. And let me point this out. You might not have noticed, there's no fruit at all. Look, Donkey Kong Jr. has 2 key mechanics you have to know. And that is, if you climb vines two-handed, you go faster. And if you go down vines with one hand, that's faster. So how you grip vines dictates kind of the speed you can navigate. And the second mechanic is that you have fruit to drop on the bad guys' heads. That's how you battle them. And there's no fruit. It's completely missing in this port of Donkey Kong Jr. It's so bare bones. I mean, it almost looks like a tech demo. But, I mean, look, even the crappy ZX Spectrum version, that had fruit for all of its faults. So that's why it ranked above this. But yeah, by far, the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong Jr. is the worst home port there ever was. Sorry, Atari. So that's it, my top 8 increasingly worse home ports of Donkey Kong Jr. What do you think? Did I get it wrong? Did I miss one that you loved that I should have included? And where would you rank it? Just throw that information in the comments down below and we can strike up a conversation. I really hope you found something to enjoy in this video, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Gen X Grown Up is dedicated to bringing you new Generation X inspired videos every week. Here are a couple more you can watch right now, but for even more, subscribe and enable those notifications. And if you love what we do, we invite you to support us over on Patreon. And of course, your feedback in the comments and a quick thumbs up are always appreciated.